Good evening. I'm Benita Zahn, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to introduce you to our speaker this evening. As you know, the Capital District Jewish Holocaust Museum is in the planning stages of construction. The importance of this memorial was made more timely, more important, by results of a recent study conducted by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. The findings are startling. 41% of Americans in general and 66% of millennials say they don't know about Auschwitz, the death camp. 22% of millennials say they never heard of the Holocaust. And those who did believe that 2 million or fewer Jews perished. The true number is 6 million. An NPR correspondent said, "How do you tell people never to forget if they don't even know?" And that's where the memorial comes in. It's a place where people can learn. And events like this evening, will they serve to educate? So we welcome our speaker, Dr. Stephen Berk, professor of history at Union College and former department chair. Dr. Berk is a gifted lecturer, sought after internationally for his expertise about the Holocaust. He has served as a consultant for the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. And having heard him speak, I can attest to his ability to bring history alive. In these polarizing times, the welfare of our country and our community is improved immensely by educators like Dr. Berk, speaking out against hatred, prejudice, bigotry, and reinforcing the need to learn from history so the errors and the crimes of the past are not repeated. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Stephen Berk.
Good evening, my friends, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk to you about the end of the Second World War and the consequences of the war. Let me begin by talking about the year 1945. Every year is important in history, but some years are more important than others. There are very few years that are more important than 1945. Because of events that took place in that year, we have all been affected. That is, it resonates, 1945 and what happened in that year resonates right down to the present time. So let me begin. I begin on January 16th of 1945. That was the end of the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last attempt to turn the tide of war. Unbeknownst to Allied intelligence, or at least to some members of the Allied intelligence community, Hitler had massed hundreds of thousands of troops in the Ardennes forest. He rolled the dice. He sent them off, caught the Allied forces, British and American forces, by surprise. The aim of his offensive was to take the city of Antwerp, the great port. If he could take Antwerp, he could stymie the invasion, he could push back the American and British forces and continue the war, perhaps for another year. We will never know. It's American blood and guts, courage, and of course, call it divine intervention, whatever you want to call it, the clearing of the skies paved the way for the American Air Force to obliterate the advancing columns, the advancing panzer divisions. The Battle of Bulge was over by January 16th. The second event of 1945 that I consider to be important is on January 27th of that year. On January 27th, the Red Army liberated Auschwitz. At the time, there were only 7,000 inmates left. The Nazis took most of the inmates and put them on forced death marches. The people that were left were sick or somehow maintained they were able to hide. Now, there's some interesting things about what happened on January 27th and the time just preceding to it. I refer you to one of the best books on Auschwitz, actually the best book. It's Primo Levi's book, Survival in Auschwitz, sometimes translated, This Be a Man. Any Holocaust survivor, an honest Holocaust survivor, will tell you that the primary function or the primary reason that they remained alive was because of luck. And Primo Levi gives a good example of that. He writes in that book, he says, we got the rumor, we heard the news that the Germans were pulling out. We were starving, absolutely starving. So he and a friend, they go around, they go to the SS barracks, and what do they find? The SS have pulled out, and there's hot food on the table. So he and his friend, they gouge themselves, they eat as much as they can, and then they feel terribly guilty. We got to go tell the other people in the barracks, there's food here. We've been starving for so long, there's food here. They go back to the barracks, 16 French inmates, concentration camp inmates, make their way to the SS barracks. Bad move, bad luck. The SS comes back and kills all 16. That's what I mean by luck. And then there's something else about the liberation of Auschwitz. There are many things that one could talk about, but this is another one that I think is important. When pictures are taken, photographs are taken by Red Army photographers of Auschwitz, very few newspapers in the United States and Great Britain are prepared to publish them. The argument is going to be in the West, this is Soviet propaganda. These things never took place. So Holocaust denial sometimes is not malicious. It's just a consequence of an inability to believe. And if people didn't believe it at that time, now 75 years after the end of the war, there are people who don't believe that the Holocaust took place at all. To be sure, there are anti-Semites out there who know that the Holocaust took place, but deliberately deny it. But for other people, again, time passes and people forget. That, I might add, is one of the reasons why we have to have a Holocaust memorial. This memorial will serve future generations of students who will come, and other people will come. They will never forget after they've seen the Holocaust memorial. A third event in 1945 that resonates right down to the present day in one form or another is the Yalta Agreement at the end of February. The big three got together for the last time. That is Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin. And the issue here, among other things, was what to do in Eastern Europe. Now, what had happened was that the Red Army had taken all of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The reason for that is, I would put it this way, as I would tell my students, you can't have your cake and eat it. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed on what Churchill called his Mediterranean strategy. We will delay the occupation or the invasion of Fortress Europe, Hitler's Fortress Europe. We've got to attack in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. We've got to whittle down, just get them down, eliminate the Wehrmacht, the German army, weaken them, and allow our air forces to knock the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, out of the sky. The problem with that, it saved lots of American lives, lots of British lives. But when I say you can't have your cake and eat it, it meant that while we were moving into North Africa and Sicily and Italy, the Red Army was pushing further and further west. The Red Army had Eastern Europe. There was nothing we could do to get them out of there. Nothing that we could do. But at Yalta, we got Stalin to sign on the dotted line that when the war was over, he would allow free elections to take place, and non-communist political parties would be allowed to participate. And lo and behold, when the war was over, Stalin violated all of the agreements. There were no free elections. The elections were rigged. All non-communist parties were banned. Non-communist politicians were either incarcerated or they were executed. Stalin had violated the Yalta Agreement. That's the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War will take on more sinister proportion. I'll talk with you about that in a few moments. But the beginning of the Cold War is the Yalta Agreement, Stalin's refusal to honor the commitments that he had made, and stationing almost 100 Red Army divisions in Eastern Europe. And the question that's going to be posed for the United States and Great Britain is, why are those Red Army divisions there? Are they there for defensive purposes? Or are they there preparing to pounce on the rest of Europe and race across the continent and reach the English Channel? The third element, the third factor, I think, in 1945 is going to be the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on April 12th of 1945. Again, there's something to be learned for this. One of the lessons you learn is it's not good to have a president who is sick. For the second time in American history, we had two presidents. Roosevelt was the second, Woodrow Wilson was the first. Twice at crucial points in time, the American president was sick. And any student of American history can tell you that one of the reasons, there are other reasons as well, but one of the major reasons that we did not join the League of Nations, did not sign the Treaty of Versailles, is going to be the fact that Woodrow Wilson was incapacitated with a series of strokes. He couldn't campaign in behalf of that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the walking dead in late 1944 and in early 1945. The blood pressure was skyrocketing. He was a smoker. He was immobile. This was a man that was in very bad shape. And this was not the kind of man that you wanted to, let's say, negotiate at Yalta. And a further element here is, when Roosevelt is dead, is of course the man who is going to replace him. Again, a good example. You cannot predict what's going to come. Nobody took Harry Truman very seriously in 1944 when he was put on the ticket. The only reason he was put on the ticket was because the former vice president, the one who was spurned by Roosevelt, was Henry Wallace. Wallace was too far left for the Democratic Party in that period of time. So they picked Truman. Truman was a creation of the Pendergast machine in Kansas City, Missouri. No one took him seriously. And yet, as any presidential historian will tell you, Truman comes out ranked pretty high as one of our great presidents. So again, there's a lesson here. It's very hard to really predict how people in high positions are going to act, when important decisions are going to be made. May 7th, May 8th, 1945, the war in Europe comes to an end. We have defeated the Nazis. Europe has been saved. The hot war is over, but as I've indicated to you, given you an inkling of, the Cold War is about to begin. Then we move into August of 1945. In August of 1945, Truman bites the bullet, makes the decision to drop nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That decision had been long in coming. It has always been a matter of debate among historians whether it was necessary to drop the bomb. I will simply tell you here is that the alternatives did not seem particularly desirable from Truman's point of view. The Navy, under Admiral Nimitz, had proposed no dropping of the atomic bomb, no invasion of the Japanese home islands. We will starve them out. We had complete control of the seas, complete control of the air. We'll starve them out, and in a year or two, they will surrender. The problem with that, of course, was, well, there was a humanitarian problem. Starving them out meant about 5 to 10 million dead Japanese. But more important for Harry Truman was, what about all of those civilians, American civilians, British civilians, Dutch civilians, that were in Japanese hands? What about the war going on in China? How many people were going to die in that year or two that was needed to bring Japan to its knees? So there were other proposals that were made. There was, of course, a proposal to invade the Japanese home islands. But after the fighting in Okinawa, the most brutal fighting in the Pacific theater, 13,000 American soldiers and Marines were killed. The kamikazes were wreaking havoc upon our Navy. The result was, in American thinking, in Truman's thinking, there can be no invasion. One estimate put it that the invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost 1 million American casualties. Even if it was half of that, that's 500,000 American casualties. For Truman, it was just too much. I reject the idea that some American historical revisionists have argued that the dropping of the atomic bomb was a warning to the Soviet Union. We've got this weapon. You better get out of Eastern Europe. We'll blow you to hell if you don't get out. Most historians, and I believe that the conventional historical view here is correct. That is not the primary reason for dropping the atomic bomb. The primary reason for the dropping of the atomic bomb was to end the war as quickly as possible. And if there is any guilt involved here, it accrues to the Japanese government, the Japanese high command, which refused to negotiate, refused to accept an unconditional surrender. So the war went on and on and on. That's the reason for the dropping of a nuclear weapon. Now, let's look at the consequences of the war. The consequences of the war are very, very substantial. And again, they echo right down to the present day. I spoke to you about the Cold War. The Cold War begins even while the hot war is going on. And the result is going to be, for those of you who have the long memory, you know what the Cold War meant for our country. It is a time of fear. It's a time of the Hollywood blacklist. It's a time when we are rearming. These are serious things. In the Soviet Union, actually, the reaction to the Cold War is going to be even more severe. Heaven help a Russian man or woman who had contact with American personnel that was stationed in Russia during the war. They will either find themselves executed or incarcerated, and if they're lucky, just under very serious suspicion. The Cold War, coming out of the hot war, is going to change American life for years, if not decades to come. And then there are the social consequences of the war. 1 million African Americans had served, men and women had served in the armed forces of the United States. Simply put, for large numbers of them, when they come out, fighting for our country, fighting to make the world a better place, opposing fascism and Nazism and Japanese imperialism, to put it as succinctly as I can, for large numbers of these African Americans, is we're not going to take this stuff anymore in our country. This is the craziness of American society. This is the stain, the blemish on our history. That is American racism, primarily as it is directed, or as was directed, to African Americans. I mean, to give you an idea how bizarre the situation was during the Second World War, I hope you are all aware of the fact that our armed forces were segregated. And in one branch of our armed forces, the Navy, Black personnel could only serve as cooks and waiters. So separate Black units, separate Air Force units, everybody knows about the Tuskegee Air Force pilots. And again, the ultimate bizarreness, for want of a better expression, is what happened in Mississippi during the Second World War. A number of German soldiers were put in prisoner of war camps in Mississippi. On a Saturday night, they were taken, under guard, of course, they were taken to movie theaters for R&R, rest and recreation. They could go to movie theaters in Mississippi on a Saturday night. The same movie theaters that would not allow a Black soldier in military uniform to enter into that theater. That's the craziness of all of this. But what I'm telling you is one of the consequences of the war is going to be the fact that African Americans, at least some of them, have said enough is enough. We're not going to do it anymore. And any study of the civil rights movement demonstrates that at the grassroots level, in terms of organizing other Blacks and sympathetic whites in behalf of voter registration and learning and whatever the case may have been, one of the things that we see is that the leadership is provided at the grassroots level by Black veterans. So the war is important here in terms of its social impact. As far as Jews are concerned, a number of things are going to take place that will change the course of Jewish history, not only in our country, but in the rest of the world. Let me begin by saying to you that the war will not end anti-Semitism. The war will not end anti-Semitism. I'm paraphrasing Plato here. Plato used to say, I'm tweaking his language. Plato used to say, only the dead have seen the last of war. I'm telling you here that only the dead Jews have seen the last of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism will be with us till the end of time. For those Jews who are confronting anti-Semitism or live in a society, all societies have anti-Semitism, the issue is not whether or not it exists. The issue is, does it exist in a magnitude large enough and powerful enough to present us with physical vulnerability? Are we going to be physically attacked? Or if we're not physically attacked, will the anti-Semitism prevent our entrance into the American mainstream? Will it prevent American Jews from becoming doctors and lawyers and university professors? And will it prevent our young people from entering the universities? That had existed in an earlier period of time. The interwar period is a more difficult time, probably the most difficult time for American Jews. That's the time of Henry Ford. That's the time of Father Coughlin. That's the time of Charles Lindbergh. But when the war is over, and Life magazine and other magazines publish those pictures of Auschwitz and Dachau, and the Nuremberg Trials begin, anti-Semitism is not eliminated, but it's very, very much reduced. If you talk about kikes and heaves and makis, you're spitting on the graves of our soldiers. In addition to that, 500,000 Jewish men and women had served in the armed forces. That gave them confidence, and the American Jewish leadership would do a good thing. It would publicize that. 500,000 Jewish men and women served in the armed forces of the United States, 11,000 had been killed, and tens of thousands had been wounded. We are patriots. And even those people who didn't think we were patriots, well, now the proof was conclusive. The Jews had really done their job, just like everybody else in American society. And as I told another group in another lecture, even Hollywood, for all of its Jewish participants, had never touched the issue of anti-Semitism in the interwar period. But now Hollywood touches it. 2 films appear. One I'm sure you have seen, Gentleman's Agreement. Gentleman's Agreement makes the case anti-Semitism is anti-American. Another film is Crossfire. They both appear in 1947. That's important. Crossfire has a very interesting, interesting story, and it shows you the limits of Hollywood. The story is set in a San Francisco bar at the end of the war. A group of demobilized Marines come in. They see someone sitting at the bar. They find out he's a Jew. They taunt him, and eventually, under the leadership of the sergeant, they kill him. And the detectives come in, and they investigate, and they find, number one, that this man, that the Jew who was sitting at the bar, that he actually had been a demobilized veteran, and he had been wounded at Iwo Jima. Somehow that never came out. He never said it. But Hollywood is giving the hechsher, to use the old language, or the imprimatur, to the fact that anti-Semitism is anti-American. You see the limits of Hollywood, because in the original story for Crossfire, the man sitting at the bar is not killed because he is Jewish, he's killed because he's a homosexual. Hollywood would not touch that for another 50 years. But when it came to anti-Semitism, all of a sudden, these Jews, these honchos, these Jewish honchos in Hollywood decided now it's now time to condemn anti-Semitism. And you see the reduction, let me say to you, of anti-Semitism and how unimportant anti-Semitism was in American political life. If there ever was a time when anti-Semitism should have reared its ugly head, it was in 1951 and 1954, when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are placed on trial for transmitting or transferring to the Soviet Union secrets of the Manhattan Project that was being developed, of course, in Los Alamos in New Mexico. 2 Jews with obviously Jewish names. They're convicted, and they're sentenced to death. But the publicity is around this. No one could deny that the Rosenbergs were Jewish. If ever there was a time that anti-Semitism should appear, this was the time that it in fact should appear. And yet it doesn't. It doesn't have any cachet, anti-Semitism, in American society. Despite the fears of American Jewish leaders that the Nuremberg trial would lead to an upsurge in anti-Semitism, it did not. It led to a good deal of suspicion. Anybody who had the name Rosenberg was going to find themselves in difficulty. But in terms of an anti-Semitic upsurge, it didn't exist. Now, more history than you ever wanted to know. There's something very interesting about the Nuremberg trial. Julius was, to be sure, a spy. Julius transferred or transmitted information to the Soviet Union about what was happening in Los Alamos. Most historians believe it wasn't terribly important. Ethel, now here's the controversy. Ethel was convicted on the grounds that she did the typing. Years later, remember, they're sentenced to death and they're executed. They have 2 children. The government shouldn't have done that. Send them to put them in life for 50 years or for life, put them in prison for life. That would have been hard. To execute a mother and a father of 2 children, it wouldn't have happened if it were not for the Cold War and the atmosphere surrounding the Cold War. But the interesting thing is, decades later, 30 years later, Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, testified that in fact, Ethel did not do the typing. Ruth Greenglass did the typing. And as he said, I had to choose between my sister and my wife. I chose to save my wife. That's why Ethel was convicted of spying, and Ethel was sentenced to death and executed. And if you want to see how much anti-Semitism had been reduced in American society, you simply look at what happened after the Rosenbergs. There were other cases. Despite the fears of Jewish leadership, when Jonathan Pollard was convicted of spying for Israel, no upsurge in anti-Semitism whatsoever. The first Senator McCarthy did not use anti-Semitism as a weapon. Embarrassing for us, of course, for Jews, was the fact that who was his chief investigator? Not the nicest man in the world, Roy Cohn, right? His chief investigator, that was his lawyer. His chief investigator was G. David Schein from Gloversville. Again, another Jew. So neither McCarthy or the unrepentant George Wallace, they too didn't play the anti-Semitic card because I think they understood that it would discredit them. So one of the consequences of the war is a tremendous diminution of anti-Semitism. The other consequence of the Holocaust is going to be the old argument in American society is going to come to an end. Before the war, large numbers of Jews were apathetic in terms of dealing with Zionism and the creation of a Jewish state. That is, many Orthodox Jews on religious grounds said only the Messiah could bring the Jews back home. For many Reform Jews, although the leadership of the Zionist movement in this country is by two great Reform rabbis, Stephen Wise and Abba Hillel Silver, the fact of the matter is many Reform Jews were a little bit quiescent, a little bit quiet on the issue of a Jewish state in Palestine. The conservative movement in Hadassah kept the flags of Zionism alive. But after Auschwitz, who can argue anymore? Do we need a Jewish state? And the answer was, there has to be a Jewish state. There has to be a place for the Holocaust survivors to go to. There has to be a place for Jews who are being persecuted in other countries. There has to be a place for the Jews of the Arab world who are being discriminated against. And close to 1 million Jews from the Arab world are going to be finding refuge in the state of Israel. The argument over Zionism that raged within the Jewish community in the period before the Second World War, it's not there. Golda Meir, as she was called then, Golda Meir, of course, as we know her, is sent by Ben Gurion to come to the United States to raise $5 million. She returns with $50 million. American Jews become Zionized, and they once they are Zionized, they proceed to Zionize American society. So again, another consequence of the war. And then there are some other things. The decolonialization of the planet, for example. When the war is over, the great colonial powers, Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, they have neither the financial nor the spiritual wherewithal to continue to hold on to their colonies. And nationalist movements in those colonies, they understand, they perceive the weakness of the colonial or the imperialist powers. In other words, they are arguing, whether it's in the Dutch East Indies, whether it is in the Congo, whether it is in Uganda, whether it is in India, and for that matter, whether it is in Palestine. That is the nationalist movements, in the case of Palestine, the Zionist movement, together with Indian nationalism and other nationalisms of all those countries that I mentioned, they know this is the time. They are aware of the weakness of the colonial powers, weakened because of the war. And what's going to happen? Within 5 years, those colonial empires are no more. India has become free in 1947-48. Israel is an independent state in 1948. The Dutch East Indies become Indonesia. And for the next decade, African countries will struggle against French and Belgian and British imperialist power. The war ends all of that. The war completes the process of decolonialization that had begun in the aftermath of World War I and now reaches its fruition and its culmination in the aftermath of World War II. And then in the realm of science, there are some very, very dramatic changes. Is there anybody out there that has never had a strep throat? Is there anybody out there who has a child or a grandchild that never had a strep throat? I'm not a physician, but I know what the standard procedure is to give a penicillin or a penicillin derivative. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. Nothing happens between 1928 and 1940. In 1940, in order to curb the infections that some British soldiers were experiencing in the aftermath of being wounded, finally penicillin is synthesized. Penicillin is used as a therapy, and eventually penicillin will become produced in mass ways and indeed to the rest of the civilian population. War is the midwife of change. So war changes that. There are other things. When this damn pandemic is over, we'll be traveling again as we traveled before. and the chances are overwhelming that you're going to be traveling on a jet plane. The only country during the Second World War to put jet aircraft in the sky were the Germans. The Germans had Messerschmitts that had jet engines. They weren't terribly effective, but they were effective enough to scare the living daylights out of the British and American governments. Even before the war came to an end, we were never able, neither we nor the British, were ever able to put jet planes, jet fighter aircraft in the sky. That's going to come after the war. And once it occurs for the military, develops where the military use it, it's going to be developed for civilian population as well. So jet aircraft, again, is another consequence of the war. Computers are a consequence of the war. Wherever you look, and you're ready for this one? You know what is developed in 1945? The microwave oven. The microwave oven is developed. Usually, it's developed by the Pentagon for military purposes, but from there, it will begin to be introduced later on into American civilian life. Wherever you look, the war has enormous consequences. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, what it's going to lead to, unfortunately, is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The United States will have a monopoly. We will share our good fortune, if you will. We'll share it with the British. The British, incidentally, are the first ones to get heavily involved in building a nuclear weapon. But it was decided by Churchill's government that the British did not have the financial means to bring it to fruition. That's why Churchill agreed that whatever British science existed at that period of time in terms of developing a nuclear weapon would be brought to the United States. We have the wherewithal to do it, and we build the nuclear weapon. One of the unfortunate consequences, of course, of the nuclear age is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But I must tell you, I don't mean to shock you. I, for one, I don't like the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but I will tell you this. Nuclear weapons have probably saved millions of lives. Not the use of them, but the existence of nuclear weapons as a deterrent. You're hard-pressed to deny the fact that if there were no nuclear weapons, we in the Soviet Union might have come to war in the aftermath of World War II. Would Stalin have been reluctant to move against the West if he didn't know? I'll put it in a more positive sense. Stalin was probably deterred from moving into the West because we had more nuclear weapons than he had. And for those of you that follow Asian developments, it's hard to believe that India and Pakistan would not have come to war. They would have come to war if there were no nuclear weapons. The fact that both Pakistan and India possess nuclear weapons, they act as a deterrent. And if they didn't have them, my own argument, my own feeling is they would have come to war. So nuclear weapons, I'm telling you, I believe is a mixed blessing. If one goes off tomorrow and we manage to survive, you can curse me for saying that was a good thing to have nuclear weapons. But I am telling you, in some ways, nuclear weapons have acted as a deterrent and they have prevented war. So what do we come with here? You look at the war, you look at the Holocaust. What do you learn from all of this? Again, I have no monopoly on the truth here. I'm not the prophet from Union College. I really don't know all of the answers here. I will tell you, you study the Holocaust and the war, you learn a number of things. Item number one here, you understand how evil racism is. The road to Auschwitz was paved with anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that had existed in Europe for almost a millennium, if not more. That's what's going to pave the road for Auschwitz. Hate, discrimination on the base of race, on the base of religion, on the base of gender. These are abominations, absolute abominations, and they must be rejected. And I would say a lesson number two. I wish I could claim him as an ancestor. He has the same last name that I have, but he spells it differently. That's Edmund Burke, the great British parliamentarian of the 18th century. In addressing the evil in society, whatever the evil may have been, Berk said, it's a very good statement. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to remain silent. I would add good men and women to remain silent. One of the lessons that one learns from the Holocaust is that you can't stay silent in the face of evil. It's not enough to turn away when someone says something, to turn away from it when evil is manifesting itself. One has to take a position. You have to stand up and fight evil. And the third thing that you learn, it would be easier to say that the Nazis who perpetrated these things, these terrible atrocities, not only against Jews, but Gypsies, Slavs, Black people, and other, these are the scum of German society. These were not really the uneducated people. Doctors who, a former physician who was the head of the German Red Cross, participated in terrible medical experiments. The Einsatzkommandos, the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, were run by lawyers, professors, clergymen. This is not the scum again of German society. One of the things that we have learned from the war and the Holocaust is that science and technology without an ethical buttress, without ethics, can lead to disaster. And finally, I must say to you, there's something else here that one has to see. When you look at the Holocaust and you look at the war, you understand how much we cheapen the words hero, heroine, and heroism. Now, I appreciate athletics. As I tell my students, 60 years ago and 50 pounds ago, I was a jock. I was pretty good. I played basketball and I ran track. I was pretty good. I understand the sacrifices that athletes make and the sacrifices that entertainers make. I believe whatever they're getting, they deserve. They put in years of struggle, years of practice, years of sacrifice. Whatever they're getting, they deserve. But they are not heroes, they are not heroines, and that's not heroism. You study the war, you study the Holocaust, and you understand what real heroes are or were, and who heroines were, and what heroism is all about. You're in a Higgins boat. You study the war, the Higgins boats. Those were the boats that took our soldiers and Marines off the LSTs and moved them to the shores. You're 30 seconds away from Omaha Beach in the morning of June 6, 1944. Or you're moving to the sands of Iwo Jima, or you're off of Guadalcanal. And the sergeant says, the ramp is going down in 30 seconds. And you charge into that fire. That's heroism. That's what heroism is all about. Or if you are a non-Jew, a Christian, living in German-occupied Poland, or any area that the Germans have occupied, and a Jew comes over to you and says, will you shelter me? The Germans are after me. They're rounding up all the Jews. Can you provide hiding for me and for my family? The overwhelming majority of Christians in German-occupied Europe will not do it. I am not condemning them. Again, I tell my students in a Holocaust class, if I were a Polish Catholic and a Jewish family came to me, I'm not sure I would have sheltered them. I know what I would not have done. I would not have raped a Jewish girl or a Jewish woman. I would not have extorted money from them. I would not betray them to the Germans. The penalty for sheltering a Jew in Eastern Europe, in German-occupied Poland, is death for you, for your spouse, for your children, and the expropriation of all of your property. The Talmud is right. Don't judge anyone until you stood in his shoes. I do not condemn them. But at the very same time, I have an appreciation for those people who, in fact, did take the risk. Hundreds of Poles were killed. This is not a whitewash on Polish anti-Semitism. Polish anti-Semitism is not an oxymoron. It was, and it is a problem in Polish society. But there were always Poles that did not participate in anti-Semitism. And during the war, a number of Poles, at great risk to themselves and their families, sheltered Jews. Those people are heroes and heroines. And finally, the people who live amongst us. We all know them, these Holocaust survivors. They saw things what no one ever should have seen. They saw rape and torture and mutilation. They saw all of those things. And when the war was over, they lost their families. Many of them lost everything they had. And many of them, most of them, when the war is over, notwithstanding the nightmares that they have, notwithstanding the mental illness that some of them experienced as a consequence of the trauma, but the overwhelming majority of them spit in the face of history, created new families, new lives for themselves, and became contributing citizens to the countries in which they are in. These are the real heroes. That's what heroism is all about. And so I'm saying to you, in behalf of the Capital District Memorial Project, this is something that is so worthwhile. Remember, always remember what had taken place. You cannot know where you are going unless you have been there, unless you know what took place. In the first day of every class that I teach, in every course that I teach at Union, I tell the students, you cannot explain the present by the present. Everything has a history. And we learn from history. Again, I don't have a monopoly on the truth. I've given you some of the lessons that I think I've learned from the war and from the Holocaust. I'm telling you, to put it another way, my friends, one of our martyrs was a man by the name of Simon Dubnov. This is one of the great Jewish historians of the late 19th and 20th centuries. He fled communist Russia and he ended up in Latvia. He was in Riga, which had a nice and large Jewish community. The Germans occupied Riga in 1941. The Einsatzgruppen came in, they killed all the Jews in Latvia, and they started with the Jews of Riga. And the story goes that Dubnov, taken out, about to be shot, yelled to one of his students. He said in Yiddish, "Schreibt und verschreibt, write and record what you have seen. By the grace of God, and by the grace of living in this wonderful country in which we are in, we don't have to write and record about these terrible things that took place for us. Instead of schreibt and verschreibt, write and record the tragedy. Study and learn. Jews and Gentiles should study and learn the war, study and learn about the Holocaust, and maybe, just maybe, we can make the 21st century the best century that humanity has ever experienced." Thank you very much for clicking in. Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Berk. It's my honor to follow, just all to take a hard look at the gift of memory. What Dr. Berk has mapped out for us, brilliantly, succinctly, and with a great sense of passion, was the need to record and remember what occurred there and pass it on as a legacy to go forward. Here's the challenge. Recent surveys have shown that over 25% of individuals under the age of 40 have a hard time identifying what the Holocaust is all about and the atrocities that occurred during that reign of terror. Why is a legacy so important to preserve in Niskayuna? Well, Dr. Berk mapped out 4 primary reasons for us. We're doomed to repeat evil if we don't learn from it. We are doomed to really have at its core racism and bigotry and discrimination and any major developments that we have unless we address and teach why it's important to put it down and why it's evil and wrong and in great detail. Dr. Berk also mapped out that science and technology go hand in hand with a sense of ethics in order to be productive and beneficial for society. Niskayuna, the home of GER&D, there is a legacy of partnership and in the shadow of growing a sense of responsibility to use wisdom, to use technology, to use things for the good. Dr. Lozman created a great vision, partnering with the Catholic Church for a parcel of land, and then with other individuals who are joined in with that passion to build a vision of a great monument that can serve as a legacy and a teaching tool to the next generation and beyond. That legacy is ours. That legacy needs to happen. We need to build it. We need to fund it. We need to educate. We need to perpetuate the memory of what occurred so it doesn't happen again. And that legacy falls on all of us. I ask for your support. I ask for your commitment to help build something that is so precious and so important. This is the gift that is ours, to not let the memory disappear 75, 80 years, 100 years after this atrocity occurs. As we have built technology on the battlefield and through the results of fighting through jet machines and through microwave ovens and through nuclear weapons, we need the ethics to say, don't forget the atrocities. And that legacy is ours. I encourage you all to support us. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating and being a part of this. Thank you, Dr. Berk. Thank you, Federation. Thank you, Benita Zahn. And thank you very much, Dr. Lozman.